You heard Dan Regard at the lunch presentation. His company is iDiscovery Solutions, which is abbreviated IDS. You might know them. A lot of them have been involved in very large organizations and very powerful positions, and they decided to put iDiscovery Solution together, and have been in business for what? You guys are 12? 12 years? 12 years. And so they have done a lot of the cases that you see in the news. So when you see things, opioids or things like that, you might not realize that there's companies like IDS that have not done the service and the work, but also testified and served as an expert on how they did the work in the courtroom. And so Mark here is running a great panel, and he has been with IDS, I think, since the beginning, right? One of the first joiners. So he signed up for it. He's got the T-shirt and everything. And so, and Mark is their CIO, which we always enjoy having. We enjoy having the Chief Information Officer, or is it information? Yeah. Oh, wow. There you go. And you know that covers many things. So this is a great session that they're putting on. Mark has put together a fabulous panel, and hopefully more people will take their cookies and come inside. So, so take it away, Mark.
Thanks very much, Robert. So after that great introduction, I'll just expand a bit, and then I'll turn it over to the panel to introduce themselves, and then we'll get going. Hopefully some people get out of the cookie coma and stagger in as we move along. So as he mentioned, I'm the CIO of IDS. In that role, I assess and advise IDS as well as our clients as our virtual CIO on IT and IS projects. I'll turn it over to Tom on the panel. If you could just spend a minute or two talking about your background, and we'll then go from there into questions.
Was Regard an expert in these cases or a defendant?
No comment.
I'm kidding. Dan's been a friend of mine for years. I'm Tom Wozinski. I'm with Haynes and Boone. Let's see, what do I do there? I've always described it as all the stuff nobody else wants to do. So, you know, it lends itself to a lot of e-discovery stuff, knowledge management stuff, and a lot of information security stuff.
Howdy, my name is Tom Thompson. I'm with a partner with a recently launched Thompson Legal. Before that, I was a partner with a couple of AmLaw 100 firms that you probably heard of. Today, my practice is roughly half and half information governance and privacy, and the other half being litigation. So, apropos of our discussion today, when the projects fall apart, I've unfortunately had the experience of litigating them afterwards as well.
Hi, I'm Jana Friedman. I'm with American Airlines. I'm a litigator, commercial litigator, but also manage the e-discovery from an in-house perspective for the company. Also manage the record retention for the company. And because of that kind of, those two different sides of the projects, I end up doing a lot of InfoSec and project kind of coordination, or at least get involved with them. So.
Okay. My name is Peter Vogel, and I'm of counsel at Foley and Lardner. Used to be Gordier Wynn back in the day, so you may remember that before we combined a couple of years ago. In any event, in spite of the fact that I'm a lawyer, before I studied law, I had a career as a computer programmer and have a master's in computer science. And my law practice has been totally exclusively limited to representing buyers and sellers of information technology and internet services. Half my practice is trial, and I've had cases in 38 states, and the other half of my practice is transactional. But in addition to that, when I had absolutely nothing else to do, I've been an adjunct law professor at SMU Law School for 30 years, and among other things, taught courses on the law of e-commerce for 15 years.
So I won't ask what you do with your spare time.
I blog a lot.
There you go. Well, thank you all. We have a great panel here today. I think you will all agree to discuss these questions we'll get to. Before we get started, I just wanted to say, anyone has any comments, any questions, any experiences, anything to contribute, let's make this collaborative, and feel free. If you raise your hand, I'll try and look periodically and call on you as soon as I see you. So the first question, a precursor to any good, successful enterprise IT or IS project is consensus. And that can often be across multiple departments and multiple disciplines. So I'd like to ask the panel, what steps are effective both internally and externally to create a strong set of champions within and without the organization? And we'll start for this with the two Toms. And I'd like to hear about how you maintain the momentum once you have the buy-in as well throughout what could be a very lengthy execution cycle.
Well, you know, a lot of it depends on what the project is. I mean, a lot of the projects that deal with information security are lockdown type projects, and so they're not that popular. But it really depends on what the driver is for the implementation. If it's client imposed, it's a lot easier to get consensus because you can just point to the client and say, it's, you know, they said so, we want to keep the client, we have to do what they're telling us or asking us to do. If it's an internally imposed project, the best thing that we found is to find champions that are well regarded amongst the lawyers, mostly lawyers. If it's IT people that are telling the lawyers they got to do something, that goes over like a lead balloon. But if you can find some lawyers that are well respected and lawyers that are known for really thinking through projects that are, you know, non-billable and really have an impact on the firm, that really goes a long way with building consensus within the other lawyers, because they tend to be able to explain exactly why we're having to do it and what the impact will be if we don't do it.
Excellent, thank you. Tom?
And if all else fails, blame the consultants.
Yeah, I think you hit the three key terms: buy-in, consensus, and champion. So buy-in, I think you have to have a recognition of the value, why you're doing the project, and really the support from the corporate leadership, the folks who want it done but aren't going to be the ones actually pushing the buttons. You might get them there at the final committee meeting. Consensus, I think early on in the project, you need to sit everybody down and agree on the plan, how you're going to tackle the project, milestones along the way especially, and especially when you have interdisciplinary teams where, you know, say it's an electronic health record or an EMR contract, you may have doctors, nurses weighing in, IT, maybe some contract compliance folks as well as legal. It can be very difficult to herd all of those cats into a room and find some consensus. And by having, I think, a plan, almost a Gantt chart in some cases, for what you're going to tackle when and how, I think you are able to move the project forward. And obviously, champions within any given project, there are going to be within each group or department the champion for the project. And I think choosing those people and keeping them engaged and involved is critical to this success. And I say this as an outsider. You know, I'm more often than not the outside counsel trying to push things along, even though I may, you know, have a somewhat limited role as the legal advisor.
I'll weigh in there too. I think champion is key, and I think that there are different types of leaders in an organization. There are leaders of groups, there are executive teams, there are people that lead functions or departments, and there are influencers. And I think one of the keys is identifying of the people who are stakeholders of the project who an influencer is or who the influencers are, and ensuring that you get those people to take ownership. So where you can find consensus or shared thoughts as to project direction, and you can have those people step up, you know, believing they're fulfilling their vision, that can be a critical piece as well. Any additional thoughts?
Well, I
Jim
have
or
one, and that is, my experience has been that anybody that's any good with a computer is incapable of having a meaningful relation with another human. And I mean, what I'm really saying by that is they're the worst communicators on earth. And so when I hang out a lot with CIOs and CISOs, and I generally try and tell them to speak in plain language, in plain English, and they are generally incapable of doing that. That's why all these
10-4,
projects
5
fail.
by 5. 10-4, 5 by 5. I'm giving you some incomprehensible English to help you out there.
Yeah, I would only, I mean, I think it's on the same line, but the first thing I wrote down was just keep talking. You just keep talking to people and talking until you get enough people to understand what the project is and you get enough momentum behind it. But, you know, it's not a let's have a meeting once a week and we'll get up the update on the status of that. You kind of have to be constantly selling this project of we really need to get this done. Here's why. Here, we're going to bring some cookies and explain it to you some more. And you also have to have people who understand the goal, what you're trying to do, the technology you're going to try to use to do it, who really understand all the facets of it. Because the most frustrating thing is to try to launch a project and you have a project manager that gets assigned to it and they really have no idea what you're trying to do. And it's very frustrating.
Yeah, I agree. I want to hear a comment. Peter, I think you're waiting to say something. Then I have an additional follow. No? So I have a follow-up.
I'm waiting on the next slide.
Okay. So I have one quick follow-up on this one. It occurs to me that one way to make progress on very large-scope projects is to iterate, to have a set of perhaps not visionary goals and to build on that over time. Any feedback on that from anyone on the panel or any experience with that, or any comments from the audience? Yeah, please.
So just on the issue of consensus, I work for a government agency, and what we found is that it's the old, we want to design a course, give it to committee, we end up with a panel.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's commenting on the difference between committee-made decisions versus small groups and the commonality of having scope creep and difficulty for consensus.
Right, or having 4 levels of DGC, the deputy general counsels or associate general counsels all have to get their mark on it. So you get a much more watered-down project.
Right.
I mean, how do you avoid that? I guess you mentioned maybe smaller groups, but
Well, you have to take the government out of it because that doesn't count. I mean, yes.
for me on that.
Yeah. Well, I have a project going on with the state of Texas right now that after 7 years still doesn't work, and we're millions of dollars over. So that's the norm, unfortunately, I think.
So I always
Like
think
you
of-
wanted a steering wheel, well, you should have included that in the RFP, you know?
I always think of 3 levels of success. Minimal, which is just the very basic minimum you need. Primary, which is your set of goals without bells and whistles. And then visionary. I would definitely, the more people or the more groups you need to involve, move down from that visionary scale and try to de-scope or try to have an incremental series. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, one thing that's helped us or helped me with projects like this is that you have to, or what I've done is formed a core group, right? And those are the people that are really going to make the decisions. And you let everybody kind of know that you know, would love to hear from everybody and get your input, but at the end of the day, it's the core group that's designing and implementing whatever it is you're doing. And you can strategically bring people in, like you can have, I call them like hidden champions. Like, you know, you get a bunch of people and you go, okay, well, let's hear from this person, and, you know, hey, what do you think? And, you know, they're gonna stop a lot of the, you know, external conversation of stuff you don't really care about that's just gonna add scope and cost and, you know,
So I'm
creep to a
hearing
project.
not only influencers, but plants, if you will, people
Yeah.
you know who are going to advocate and strengthen the case.
Yeah, and they have to be, you know, they have to be trusted plants, but yeah. You can't start a project off and just, you know, give everybody an open mic and expect them that they expect all to be heard and the project can't move forward without their thoughts.
And to that point, I mean, you're never going to, it's the old, you know, you're not going to
Yeah,
make
right. You're not
100%
gonna
of the
make
people
everybody
happy all of the
happy.
time. So you're looking
Right.
for a consensus. Yes, please.
I was just gonna say that I find that, what's in it for them, right, whenever I'm gonna pitch a big project, making sure that when I'm speaking to a county, I'm focusing on their pain point, right? So as the one person who's trying to bridge that gap, have a little bit of flexibility. to make
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So understanding that all of your different stakeholder groups have different pain points, different needs, and putting things in their frame of reference to get the buy-in, that makes a lot of sense.
And the other thing that really helps too is if you have a project manager that is not just a, you know, strict project manager, somebody that also actually understands the project and what it's going to do for the group you're doing it for. There have been, you know, several instances where we've had project managers that, you know, they have PMP, and they're great project managers, but they have no idea what it is we're trying to implement. And so, they go off to these meetings and get comments back, and it's like, what meeting were you in? Because what they're saying just, makes no sense.
The trusted plants during the earlier part of the project can also be very, very useful during the implementation phase. When you go live and you start to get the resistance from the regular users, those trusted plants can then become kind of the internal resources for that, whatever department or discipline they're in to help school the others, and to hopefully, if obviously they share the same vision, to tamp down any serious uprising against the new changes, because face it, when it comes to it, I don't think humans like change for the most part, and will resist just by nature.
Yeah, the easiest alternative is always the status quo without changing. I do want to touch on something just off to the side. So one of the things that you're raising indirectly, Tom, is the importance of having knowledge, eliminating ambiguity as early in the project cycle as you can. And that goes not only to the project manager, but to a shared understanding. There's a lot of time, money, resources wasted by not building the right thing the first time. So we won't really, I don't think, explicitly get into that anymore, but that is a very important aspect of undertaking projects of any scope. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the...
One thing I just want to say real quick. One thing that kind of goes along the same lines as that is that as questions come up in various meetings that you have with people, if somebody, appoint somebody to keep track of these questions so that you can answer them uniformly between the groups, and there's not, this group heard this and this group heard this. It's more of a ongoing FAQ.
Absolutely. All right, so we're going to move on to common pitfalls. And right now we're talking about some of the problems you encounter, and we'll point to some ways to avoid them. Our final talking point is going to be on 10 IT commandments. Thanks to Peter for submitting that as one of the topics for us to talk about. But here's the question. What are some of the common pitfalls that you encounter when trying to implement an IT or InfoSec project with enterprise scope? And how can you avoid them or minimize their impact? And I'd like to start with you, Jana, if I could, and go over to Peter from there.
Sure. My biggest, what I see in projects that make them difficult or see after the fact, because a lot of times we're after the fact litigating about technology we purchased or products that we wanted to be built, that we've asked to be built. And over-customization is something that across the board is a huge problem. And the more we want somebody to customize something, the more it's just going to get messed up. And the people asking for it don't really know what they're asking for and don't have the technical expertise. And the people selling it to us will promise us anything.
That's commandment number 8, I might add.
And so it's really, so for me, the projects that I work on, I want things to come out of the box as much as possible. I want to be able to call the regular technician at that company and then be able to run whatever I have, because every time I customize something, I take myself out of that. So that's one of kind of my pet peeves about it. But also, the other thing I've seen is kind of desperation and wanting something really bad. And so somebody in the business really wants something. Somebody tells them they can get it, and instead of doing a regular RFP, instead of going through the whole process, they think this is there's a quick answer, quick fix. They tell me I can get what I want. Then all reasonable thought goes out the window. Like, did we check if they've ever done this before? Did we talk to their other, just some basic things, but when the business wants something, they just want it. And so those are the kind of 2 biggest pitfalls I've seen.
And I think depending on the scope of the change or the customization, a single customization can drive you completely off track, or it can be death by 1,000 cuts. And people are saying, oh, well, changing the color here, changing the font here, adding this function here, but when you take them in total, they totally put the developers into a state of churn, so you can't succeed with the project. Peter, what are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things I found, and I guess just by way of example, because I've litigated so many of these failed ERP implementations, is that the vendor, or the implementer, I should say, generally has an expectation that when they sign the contract, that it's going to end up being 3 or 4x. So everything you've talked about, it's the only way to get to 3 or 4x is to bring in, oh, you needed that, well, then we're going to have to bring in another team from another country to work on that project because we never understood you needed 12 people to work on it or whatever. And the scope continues to grow beyond expectations. I had a client a few years ago that was going to get an new ERP system, and I told them it would be like 3 or 4x, and they said, no, we promised the board that it would be on price, on schedule and all, and 3 years later, it was 4x, because that's the way the implementer operates.
So is the answer better scoping up front, better communication of requirements?
No,
or
no,
is
the
there an understanding?
implementer expects to make that money. When they sign the contract, that's what they expect. I mean, I'm saying this in the worst way possible because they're only half my clients. That depends on, who I'm representing. But my sense is they want to staff up. They want to make more money. That's the whole point of that kind of implementation.
So the pitfall is not understanding the hidden costs that expand the overall
Or I
cost of
think,
the
as
project.
Janet pointed out, though, too, and that is, if you clearly identify everything you really need to do and you get it solidified to the plan and you get the vendor to commit to it, then you build that. You don't change it midstream, and I think that's part of the problem.
Tom, any thoughts?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what everybody was saying, really, is that it's a matter of planning and scoping out and figuring out what's really important, because, everybody wants to have their input, and if you can't nail down exactly what exactly the plan is, then there's always scope creep. I mean, it's, we've used tools like Smartsheet and things like that, so we go through and, scope out every piece of minutia that could happen and when it's supposed to happen, and, and again, it goes back to like a lot of the project management aspect of it is, if you got somebody that will hold people's feet to the fire of, a good project manager will go throughout the different teams and say, okay, if we're going to make this deadline, and there's multiple deadlines during the project, then you need to have X, Y, and Z done by this date. If you do not, this is going to slip.
Very good. Tom?
Yeah, and to echo Tom's concerns, I refer to it as drift, where say something needs to be done, or you need to have an input from some individual or department. It doesn't come in on time. Obviously, you maybe have a scheduled meeting to discuss what whatever the deliverable is going to be in the interim, but then you don't have it, and so then you're stuck, having missed a milestone and having to essentially start the drifting process.
And you're never going to catch up. I mean, that's another, that should be the 11th commandment, is if a date slips, you will never, ever catch up.
No, actually, I do have an 11th commandment that someone came up with that I think you'll like, and that is,
See number 1.
any IT project large enough to have its own acronym, like Moonshine or Sahara, will fail.
We have a question?
That wasn't part of my 10.
Or a
Client
comment?
volunteered it.
My question is sort of directed to you, Peter, is that it sounds like you might be advocating for managing expectations by building in mission creep.
No, I don't think that's it. As a matter of fact, I had lunch the other day with an implementer for ERP systems, and I made that same comment. I don't know how many of y'all know this statistic, but a friend of mine, an academic, has done a study, and I think something between 65 to 70% of all ERP projects fail to comply with whatever the original contract says. So this guy the other day said, well, what we do is we just build in what we know is really going to be required, so they make all their deadlines and they do everything right. And I think most vendors want to do the low ball price. Like, for instance, that government contract I mentioned earlier, the state put out an RFP. We had 3 vendors respond. 2 came in at $72 million, and the successful vendor came in at 36. So all I could think of is they're going to try and get to 72 in the next 10 years is what they're going to do.
So I think there's an interesting aspect of that cost that I've seen working with enterprise projects for clients, and that's the cost component that's an ongoing cost. So one of the common pitfalls that I've seen is that even when everything goes very well throughout development and deployment, there are costs that aren't captured or realized without explicit efforts to do so. You might be relying on an operating system or a library or an integration with another component, and things change, things evolve, things move forward. So unless, to Jana's point, it's strictly COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software, which eliminates this, well, then you have company issues, of course.
Not absolutely.
Not
but it's
absolutely,
supposed to,
but
yeah.
you'll have issues of needing to maintain and support, and that's part of the product life cycle that's normally not explicitly thought through at the
Or
front.
so when Windows does an end of life on the server version, and all of a sudden it isn't a little change, it's a significant change, and you can't do it on-prem anymore. You have to go to Amazon Cloud or something, and you don't have that baked in either.
Sure. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. Thank you for all the feedback on that. So we've talked today a great deal about IS and regulatory impacts, new privacy laws coming up at various state, federal, international levels. And so I want to ask, how are these increasing requirements, practices, regulations affecting the development of IS and IT projects and decisions that are being made? And what are some of the practical impacts of these new requirements?
So, has anybody read the GDPR? You're just as sick as me. Okay. So I've actually read it twice, and it, like it goes back to your point of building a horse by committee. That's exactly what this thing reads like. Is like 100 different committees came up with 100 rules. But if after people get done with the freak out period of this thing going into effect, you got to look back and figure out what the real target of this was, and it was really companies like Amazon and Facebook and things like that. Like everybody remembers back when Facebook was selling information. Well, they weren't selling it, right? So that's what they claim. And it was really an aim toward those kind of folks, and the impact for smaller companies, especially law firms, is it really created a little bit of a freak out on how people look at information. But I think one of the outcomes of things like the GDPR and CCPA in California, which, by the way, is probably going to be replicated throughout the states as they kind of figure out the little quirks and things that will get fixed with the CCPA. But it makes people think a lot more about how they store data and store data based on the requirements of having to comply with like GDPR and some of the provisions in there where you have things like this is kind of, if you've never read it, this is one interesting thing. You have a right to be forgotten, right? And what that really means is that after some period of time, if you were an applicant for a job at a company, they have to get rid of all the information. So I guess in theory, you could apply every 3 years, and if nobody was there that remembered you, you could.
Well, not if you use blockchain to protect that, because then it's locked down.
Right, then it's locked down. We actually had something go on, and there's going to be people testing these systems too. And this is a real life story. We actually had somebody who sent our firm an email that said, "Please get rid of all of my information." And the first thing we did, there was not an explanation like, "Hey, I was an applicant," or "Hey, I was a law student," or any of this. And so we had to go back through. We've actually been in this big project of redefining how we store our data and that. So it made it not as difficult. But we went through everything we could and figured out that no, we don't have anything that pertains to this person. Only to find out that the person who sent us this email is a professor at Berkeley University School of Law. And so as best we can figure out, she's got to be running some kind of research project where she sends out emails to the AmLaw 100 and can go back to her class and say, "Okay, here's what I did." 70% of the people never ever responded. We actually responded and say, "I'm sorry, we don't have anything about you."
Well, you would respond, but you deleted her information, so you can't contact her.
There you go. And so, you know, as part of the response, you know, we actually said, hey, if you have reason to believe that we do, you know, maybe under a different name or an alias or something, please let us know. And we haven't heard back from the person. But, you know, if that's not enough to like get you going and, you know, rethinking about how you store information, I was checking some facts on like GDPR and some of the violations that they've had so far with GDPR. The majority of the violations have been in 2019. There have been 32 violations, 34 total, 2 in 2018, 32 in 2019. And so far, the fines have been around 350 million euros. And so if you're a big company, the fines can really add up too, because it's the top fine, or the fines are 20 million euros or 4% of your profit, and no limit.
The greater.
The greater of the two.
The greater of the two. And so that's, you know, when you start adding up numbers like that, and you are a company like a Google, that really starts to ring the bell of just how bad things
But
can
how
will
many
get your
cases
attention.
have been filed in the United States or in front of courts in this country?
Zero. Zero.
And I think we have a long time to figure out how the courts in this country are going to react, because I can't think of a single judge that I know of that would ever think that GDPR applies in the United States. So that's a challenge that yet to be seen, I think.
Right, and it's probably going to, you know, it's going to relate to companies who do business in the EU. You know, it's that arm of their company that's going to get nailed.
Any other feedback on this topic?
There's a
Oh, thank you.
Tom, isn't it accurate, though, that if you are here resident in Texas, you have a client in the EU, that you have to comply with the GDPR even though you're a resident here?
Well, that all goes, you know, that a lot of that is upfront dealings with the client. Like we get some things, like we have foreign clients where in the engagement letter that they build that stuff into the engagement letter that we will comply.
But what about, you know, say, e-commerce? So if we're here, you know, selling, sunglasses or whatever, and we have a buyer from the EU to actually ship to them, are we governed by GDPR?
Well, theoretically, that's a debatable issue of great interest, because my experience has been about less than 1% of the population reads terms of service and click agreements for starters. And most companies that are based in the U.S., if they have any control over it, they say the jurisdiction venue of all the transactions are going to be in
US.
Texas.
Right.
And so that's what I'm saying is when the courts have to look at it, we may get a different picture on it, but that's what the contract says. So I just did a project for a client, an international client, and I did their terms of service and click agreement for a game app, which kind of hurts my head that they're even doing this to begin with. But we ended up deciding to base it in Germany so that all the data would be in the EU, so we wouldn't even have this conflict. So you have to make decisions like that. Where do you store the data?
So I can just add the perspective from the corporate side, and, you know, we have a GDPR, we have an in-house privacy officer, we have a whole GDPR program, and we respond to people's requests all the time to either forget them or to give them all of their information, and we have a portal and a pretty mature system for that at this point. The great part, because when you talk about how does this affect other IT projects in the company, the great aspect of GDPR and our privacy office is it gives them a seat at the table in a lot of discussions that they wouldn't have had, and gives us a lot more insight into the data that's being created and stored and where it's being stored and the retention policies on it. And so I used to do a lot of FCPA work, and companies, while they didn't want to monitor, at some point the in-house counsel would be like, that was the best thing that happened because we got all this kind of extra help and resources for our compliance work that we're doing. This is a little bit the same. Like, we're getting a lot more support. That group has a lot more budget than the rest of us do. So it helps us in other areas of the company, for data hygiene, which
Yeah,
is
that's
what
an
it gets
interesting
at, and it
perspective.
gives us that budget to do that.
And I think Tom made that comment earlier about CCPA, because we really don't know exactly how that's going to play out. So I think it was very telling that Microsoft said they're going to treat every transaction in the United States as if it's under CCPA. I'm encouraging clients to do that too, because I think it's a lot less complicated to isolate where the data may be and how many transactions you have and whether or not CCA really applies. So I think that's going to be a driver to have more of those kinds of laws.
Excellent.
Who
Thank
thought
you all.
something good could come out of GDPR, right?
Let's not get carried away there. All right, so we're going to move on to new technologies. And we already had some great panel discussions about what some of those new technologies are. What I want to focus on, many businesses embrace the use of new technologies to minimize costs, maximize efficiency, improve quality, that sort of thing. What are some of the novel technologies now coming to market that you believe will have an impact on the legal technology sector? And I'm going to start with you, Peter.
Well, I've already mentioned a couple, at least one, and I think blockchain is kind of a mover in this space right now because people aren't exactly ready for it, but I think it's coming. And I'll put in a plug for this. I've recently started a blockchain study group at the Dallas Bar at BELO every month, so come join us to talk about this junk. But the reason I say that is this moves very slowly. Put it in the right perspective. When I first started working with artificial intelligence, it was 1972. It's been going pretty slowly there. And I think that the expectations I've read from Gartner and other studies is that blockchain's probably really not going to take off for maybe another 10 years, but it's underway, and we have to deal with it.
So just at a very high level, could you talk about the basic elements of blockchain and what it is?
It's a distributed database that is locked down so that, like in supply chain management, for instance, Walmart uses blockchain to manage where they buy vegetables so that if there's some kind of infection that breaks out, they can trace it back to the field. And so I think we're going to see more things like that. Starbucks is doing it, and they're managing every coffee bean that they transport. They have it in a blockchain management scheme. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect and it all works, but I think it's going there. And then when it's locked down and it's immutable, it makes it more complicated. And Bitcoin is, I think, what we're all familiar with, but this is the practical use. And this is not new either. This started in 1979. So it's a slow process, and it's a lot slower than people like to think.
Other feedback? Dan.
Why does Starbucks need a blockchain to track supply chain?
Well, their story is, beside the fact that I don't try and give advice to Amazon about what they do or don't do, or Starbucks or anybody else, but I think it's the same thing with Walmart. They're concerned that if there's some bad coffee beans that are grown in Chile or Brazil or something, they'd like to be able to cut off that supply chain and lock it down. And that's
Well,
the only way to know how to do that.
And perhaps there are
Theoretically.
facilities related to it being distributed that lend itself well to a technology that allows decentralized manipulation of data with trust.
So Maersk, which is the largest shipping company in the world, they're developing blockchain applications to manage where all their freight is all over the world. That's not a crazy idea, but it gets crazier, I think, when you start talking about, most of us remember that the Texas Revolution occurred in 1836. Well, all the property records go back to 1836 for every piece of real property. Well, theoretically, we could have blockchain to manage all that. The title companies are not real thrilled about the concept, but in 254 counties, most of the title records are in paper. They're not all online, so it gets more complicated, and we have to look at all these things if we're going to get automated. I think about 2 states have started real property blockchain management systems, New Hampshire and I think New Mexico,
Thank you, Peter. Any other thoughts from the panel?
I'll just raise this as a question because I'm not all that familiar with the blockchain technologies, but it seems to me then that be curious as to both the audience and panel members' thoughts as to whether there's inherent tension and/or looming collision between, for example, blockchain technology and for CCPA rights, for example. If somebody says, I want to be forgotten and delete my stuff.
They are in direct conflict. That's one of the crazy parts in GDPR, because if you have to have the right to be forgotten and it's an immutable distributed database, how can it be immutable? Okay, I'm sorry. Those are the public databases. Here's my problem with it too. It's all written in open source. So I don't have any confidence that there aren't back doors. This is much more complicated.
So in Peter's point, at a high level, blockchain works by adding blocks. It's a chain of blocks of data. So once a block is added and finalized into that storage mechanism, it's there. It's designed to not be able to be changed. So that's an interesting point, Tom.
Yeah.
Immutable, right. Any other feedback from the panel or any questions on this topic?
But this isn't directly related to totally new technology like that, but kind of going back to your point, there's some technologies out there that very useful technologies that really conflict with the legal profession or law firms and things that we do, technologies like, Google Translate. One of the things that just drives me up a wall is we'll have somebody that we'll have a Chinese client that will send us an email about a patent, and you'll have some patent lawyer go and paste that email in Google and going back to terms of service, and nobody reads the terms of service. Well, guess who's got all that, intellectual property now? Google. So, if you read the terms of service on a lot of these free services, they're free-ish. Or Grammarly's another good one. You get a law student that, or just a first-year lawyer that's, writing a memo or a brief or something and wants, perfect grammar. They cut and paste it into Grammarly, and if you go read Grammarly's, terms of service, well, Grammarly's got all your stuff.
So
so does LinkedIn. One of the crazy parts people don't think about is that when you send a message to somebody on LinkedIn, let's go have lunch next week, LinkedIn has a license to that, and they know that if you're conducting business with American Airlines or somebody else, they have the right to that, and you give them a license because nobody pays attention to such things.
There are also interesting implications with terms of lexicon, syntax, semantics. When you're giving power to translate or power to interpret the language to this single source for all, a market leader, there are implications for how our language develops or how translations are made. There's a lot of power in those hands. But in terms of new technologies and development in our sector, I think the language translation is something that's come a long way from Dragon naturally speaking, 20, 25 years ago to the current real-time voice translations. So.
Yeah, and it's, it's like public policy is not catching up with the technology. It's lagging farther and farther behind.
Any other thoughts on new technologies before we move to the next question?
Talking about legacy systems, we merged with US Airways a little while back. So we have lots of legacy systems, and really even within American, there's just always change, and servers are always going end of life, and there's just always changes having to be made. And people are always digging up a server from a closet and saying, I wonder what this is. Well, you got to find out. And it's just a constant process, and so we constantly work on it, and there's no quick answer or fast answer to it. You have to go out and find all the constituents who might have stuff on there. Do they need it anymore? Do they not need it? Do we need to upgrade it or not?
And do you have the password anymore to even get into it?
Can you get into it? Is it still even available to you? And I think it brings one of my other pet peeves, maybe. I guess I have a lot of pet peeves, but one of those is we constantly go to meetings with people who are trying to get rid of a legacy system or update something. And they think technology is going to be the key to doing those processes. And a good consultant will tell you, and maybe one instance when they're right, is that new technology never can solve process problems that you already have. And so no matter what the issue is that you're dealing with, you've always got to have the right process around it. as opposed to some new neat tool. I think we hear about data retention tools, and we're gonna update the legacy system. We're gonna put it in the cloud. As we hear this all the time, we're gonna put it in the cloud, and we're gonna put retention on it because we've got this new, we're gonna get this new software that will do that. It's like the new software will not do that for you. You're going to have to go determine what that data is and figure out what the retention policy is and program the new software with that information. And it just gets lost. People don't.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head with ongoing activity. That resonates with me. So IT studies estimate that what you call technical debt, which is the amount of being out of sync you get from legacy systems every year, is 22%. So within 5 years, a system, if nothing is done to it, will become unusable, need updating. And if you ignore the problem, you just exacerbate it. And there are a lot of different ways that systems can become unusable. We talked about it briefly: libraries, operating systems, programming languages, ancillary tools, skills of the people in the building, the infrastructure. It goes on and on. So I think Jana's point, American Airlines does it right in terms of technical debt. It's an ongoing thing to modernize systems, and that's the way
And
to
of course,
get it
the
right.
end of life is a great target for cyber criminals as well, because they know that there's no protection available for the old system, whatever it may be.
Any other thoughts from the panel on legacy systems?
Ideally, the records managers or legal will be brought in before the final decision's made to mothball the server or update it.
You got a question?
Yes, Dan.
I'll give you a corollary for legacy systems. A lot of times we have clients who have been handling their email on-prem, and they are constantly rebalancing their servers, so that when we need to go back to archive to retrieve custodian files, we have no idea which backups contain which custodians for any given time period. So just like we talk about archiving information about passwords and user accounts and versions, we've encouraged clients to delay that rebalancing so that it's done on a scheduled basis. And they actually create a custodian map of each of the servers before they do the rebalancing. I think there are other parallels to that.
Absolutely. That's a good point, Dan. Just as we have legacy systems, I think we have legacy data architectures, if you will, as we both increase the number of data systems we use and the usage scenarios for data. We have to make sure that we're updating our internal systems that maintain and modify that data, as well as the systems that utilize the data. So that's a good point. Thank you. We're going to move on now to risk. We talked about risk in a couple of panels earlier today. So what do you see as the biggest risks today and 10 years from now? And how can firms position themselves to benefit from this information? Who would like to take the lead on this?
People and people.
People and people. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, we always look at the information security policies around the firm, and always the weakest link has been people. Don't click on something, and who clicks on it? People. Machines don't click on it, right? So it's, in 10 years from now, maybe there's no people. I don't know. No, in 10 years from now, I think, some of the.
I think you're right. The human element will always be there, and you always need to be aware of it to minimize some types of risk. Absolutely. Other comments? Peter, I see you smiling there.
No, I agree with Tom. I think that's true. But I think part of the problem is, since I spend a disproportionate amount of time dealing with cyber intrusions and problems with that, is that cyber criminals don't do what they did last week or last year. They come up with something new and different and are creative. So it's very difficult to figure out where we're going to be with cyber crime in the future. And right now, NIST, I just saw a report the other day, they believe in the next 4 years that we're going to be like 1.8 million people short of the adequate number of people to handle cybersecurity in the world. So if that, even if they're half wrong, that's a disturbing number that we don't have enough cybersecurity people to handle the problems.
So if you've ever wanted to learn how to be a hacker, here's the bottom gateway into it. Beat knowing that, I mean, that's a
Well,
scary
the
number.
criminals have, cybercrime as a service. You can just go buy it on the dark web. I mean, it's not complicated.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah.
And there will always be an ongoing cat and mouse, like any other
Right.
type of security.
Well, and the other part that goes along with it, the insurance can't keep up with that either. They can't figure out what's going to happen next. The policies are a mess.
Right.
Yeah.
Our time is almost up, but we're going to finish here with a question, and then we'll open it up if there's any time. This is an opportunity for the panel to tell you about one or two or three, maybe it should be 10, but one or two or three rules of IT contract, procurement, execution that they want to leave you with. So thanks to Peter for suggesting this, and we'll start with you, Peter, for your ITIS contract commandments.
Well, I've been giving a speech called the 10 Commandments of IT contracts for forever. And I've come up, they're not really 10, but it sounds better. It's got a nice literary ring. But my first commandment is no IT project is ever completed on time, which goes back to what I think we talked about earlier. And then the second one is no project is ever complete. So the one I like best is some friends, after I did a blog on this, somebody recommended I already give you number 11. Number 12, this is the best of all. Before every IT project, select a scapegoat and do not invite that person to meetings. Is that great or what?
Jana.
I'm writing that one down.
I'll send them to you.
I think my primary advice, probably from just the litigation side of litigating a lot of these IT contracts, when they all go south, they don't all go south, but when a lot of them go south, is just understand the project that you're trying to complete, understand what the goal is, and have enough definition in the contract in what you're trying to do. There's just too many contracts that have this vague description, and you go back later and try to litigate, and you're like, well, what was it we were trying to buy? Well, it changed, it morphed, it this, that.
Absolutely.
Understand what you're trying to buy so that you're contracting for it.
Eliminate ambiguity. Absolutely. Tom.
I suppose I'd focus on know the entire chain of your contracts and who's going to be performing services, because the dark underbelly is often the sub-service providers as far as breach events. And so as part of that, obviously contractual provisions are just a piece of paper, but one method of legal protection is the contract commandments going through the entire supply chain, but also actually enforcing and making sure that the principles are adhered to.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Tom.
I just kind of echo what they all say, but one thing that is, again, always helpful is, really have a project manager that really understands the project and then also understands the contract. And, because I can't tell you how many times we've had projects where the project manager who thinks they understand the project never looks at the contract, and all the stuff that they think is part of the project plan is not written into the contract, and then it comes down to if you want that, well, that's going to cost.
Well, let me make one suggestion on that, and I think it's kind of missing here, but my suggestion, and it is something that I've been a big advocate of, and that is that the person negotiating the contract ought to understand the lawyer needs to understand the IT piece, and I don't think that's always the case. Oftentimes, they're just reading, whatever the standard language is, and they go along with it. Or the business, this is the part that makes me crazy, is when my client's negotiating a deal, they say, we'll negotiate all the business issues, and when we get done with that, then we'll come to the legal issues. Well, I think they're all the same.
They are.
And when you give away the farm before the lawyer ever gets there, it's a little late to do anything about it.
So I agree with all the feedback, and I'll try and put a bow on it. I think the message through all of this, in terms of setting yourself up for success, is to do all of the hard work up front, because if you don't, it'll come back to bite you in multiples of cost later on. So eliminate all the ambiguity as early as you can in the cycle. With that, we are over our time, so if you'll join me in giving the panel a round of applause, you all are fantastic. Thank you.